On the 22nd of May 1887, Lady Geraldine Somerset wrote in her journal about one of the most unique human beings to have ever lived. She reported that he appeared as though he had an elephant's head and a protruding face like a snout, one enormous hand like the foot of an elephant. Despite being shocked by his appearance, she noted that he was a gentle, kindly man. Somerset was describing Joseph Merrick, who for a time became famous in Victorian England. What explains the physical afflictions of the man who became known as the Elephant Man, and what happened to him? This is the story of Joseph Merrick, one of history's most misunderstood figures. The man known to history as the Elephant Man, whose real name was Joseph Carey Merrick, was born on the 5th of August 1862 in Leicester. There has been much confusion surrounding his name due to the fact that his first biographer, Frederick Treves, who was also Merrick's doctor, incorrectly referred to him as John in his memoirs, The Elephant Man and Other Reminiscences, published in 1923. His father was Joseph Rockley Merrick, a carriage driver and factory worker who was born sometime around 1837, while his mother was Mary Jane Merrick, a Sunday school teacher of the Baptist Church who married Joseph in December 1861. Born to a poor farm family in the small hamlet of Evington just outside Leicester, Mary Jane was reported to be physically disabled in some way, although the specific details are unclear. After their marriage, the newlyweds established a home at 50 Lee Street in Humberston Gate, in the centre of Leicester, a couple of doors away from Joseph's mother. His younger brother, William, was born in January 1866 and was seemingly healthy, but Joseph's younger sister, Marian Eliza, was physically disabled from birth. Joseph Merrick would become infamous for having a large, malformed head with many bony lumps, an oversized jaw, and a bulge on his upper lip which drooped down like a trunk. This ultimately led to the nickname, the Elephant Man. His back and chest were also covered in large patches of rough, loose skin that were covered in small warts and which had a fibrous texture similar to that of cauliflower. He had an enlarged and misshapen right arm attached to a right hand that had thick, root-like fingers and a bulbous thumb that looked like a radish. The only body parts unaffected were his left arm and left hand. Merrick most likely suffered from Proteus syndrome, an extremely rare genetic condition affecting less than 1 person in a million that causes progressive and abnormal growths in bones, skin, organs, and tissue. Merrick's mind was much healthier. He was a curious individual who was well-read in later life, both in terms of religious works like the Bible, the newspapers, and 19th century literature such as the writings of Jane Austen and Charles Dickens. Unfortunately, he was increasingly unable to share his views in later life, as his speech was so affected by his physical illness, leading him to internalize his feelings. He was extremely sensitive about his condition, particularly the manner in which it precluded him from pursuing a romantic relationship. As Treves would later put it, he would like to have been a lover, to have walked with the beloved object in the languorous shades of some beautiful garden, and to have poured into her ear all the glowing utterances that he had rehearsed in his heart. At the time of his birth, Merrick's hometown of Leicester was going through unprecedented change due to the impact of the Industrial Revolution, which had transformed the Midland city into a manufacturing powerhouse specializing in textiles. As factories expanded, so too did the desire for distractions like circuses and freak shows, the name given in the 19th century to shows featuring people with physical abnormalities and rare medical disorders. Humberston Gate, where Joseph was from, was famed for its annual May Fair, where caged exotic animals like tigers, wolves, leopards, monkeys, zebras, antelopes, parrots, and pelicans were paraded in front of paying customers. At midday, as was the custom, the operators of these mobile zoos often led small herds of elephants through the streets in a great grey procession. Merrick would later claim that his mother was knocked down by one of these animals during her pregnancy, though the story is dubious and might have been invented to add to the mystery surrounding a figure who, after all, became known as the Elephant Man. Joseph was a perfectly normal and seemingly healthy baby when he was born, with no sign of the physical deformities that would later make him world famous. He was strong enough as an infant to survive a smallpox epidemic that ravaged Leicester just after his birth. The first sign that something was wrong was seen when he was 5 years old, when his mother noticed that his lower lip was puffing up. This small protrusion eventually developed into a tumour that took up much of his right cheek and which began to push his upper lip outwards. Next, a bony lump on his forehead expanded in size, and then bumps appeared on his right arm and feet, making his skin loose and rough to the touch. Shortly after the birth of her second child, William Arthur, who developed normally, Mary Jane's deformed firstborn suffered more misery when, after falling and damaging his left hip, a disease at the joint left him permanently crippled and unable to do much more than limp. Disabled and bloating out more and more every year, his mother tried to maintain a semblance of normality by sending him to school each day, but his appearance made it impossible for him to fit in with the other children. Meanwhile, with a difficult family situation to contend with, Merrick's father applied himself at work, achieving several promotions at a cotton factory while also simultaneously managing a moderately successful men's clothing business or haberdashery. But professional success was soon marred by personal tragedy. On the 21st of December 1870, his 4-year-old son, William, passed away after contracting scarlet fever. 3 years later, in May 1873, the family was struck by another devastating blow when Joseph's mother died from bronchopneumonia. Merrick would later remark that it was the greatest misfortune of my life. Following the death of his younger son and wife within a few years of one another, Merrick's father downsized and moved with Joseph and Marian Eliza into cheap accommodation on Birstall Street, which they shared with other lodgers. A year and a half later, he married the landlady of the lodging house, Emma Wood Anthill. Smitten with his new wife and stepchildren, Merrick's father distanced himself from his son, whose appearance unsettled his stepmother and step-siblings. In the meantime, Joseph finished his education at the newly constructed board school in Siston Street, graduating at age 12, which was considered the last formal year of schooling for most people in Victorian Britain. Then, at the urging of his insistent stepmother, who wanted him out of the house, he found work at a cigar factory where he rolled handcrafted cigars for the next 2 years until further abnormal growth in his fingers made it impossible for him to perform the delicate hand movements required to do the job anymore. 2 long years of unemployment followed, during which his stepmother unfairly characterized him as a financial drain on the family. At dinner, she often gave him a half-full plate of food and sneered that it was more than he deserved. Joseph's only ally in the household was his father, who, despite being emotionally withdrawn, tried to find employment for his son. With his assistance, he received a hawker's license, which allowed him to go door to door selling products from his father's haberdashery, like stockings and gloves. Joseph was expected to sell a certain amount of goods every day, but this was difficult because his appearance made it so that people were reluctant to answer the door to him. In 1877, having failed to meet his sales quota, his father attacked and beat him, leading Joseph to leave him at only 15 years of age, never to return. For a while thereafter, Merrick scratched out a living on the streets, selling whatever he could and spending his meagre earnings on food and cheap accommodation. Hearing of his nephew's plight, his more sympathetic Uncle Charles, who was a hairdresser by trade, offered him a room in his house above his salon. Over the next 2 years, as his symptoms progressed, with no sign of slowing down, Merrick continued to eke out a living selling some clothes as a wandering salesman until the authorities refused to issue his license because his appearance, which people had no way of understanding medically in the 19th century, was scaring away customers. Eventually, Merrick's uncle also had to move Joseph along. He had a newborn to take care of, and Merrick was forced to find employment instead at the Leicester Union workhouse, a place where the poorest individuals in society did back-breaking labour in exchange for food and shelter. Reporting to his overseer for the first time on Monday the 29th of December 1879, he was assigned a straw-stuffed mattress in a cold stone dormitory and a small locker before being put to work with inmates from Group Number 1, which was exclusively reserved for drunkards, vagrants, and people with mental and physical handicaps. Throughout this period, Merrick's body continued to change. The most significant new growth occurred around his trunk-like upper lip, which was already long and heavy to begin with. It was now stretching down to such a degree that it was becoming impossible for him to eat without food falling out of his mouth, while making it extremely difficult for him to speak clearly. In 1882, his case caught the interest of doctors from the Leicester Infirmary, who offered to cut off part of the trunk on his upper lip that was causing him so much bother. Administering pain-dulling chloroform, the most common form of medical anesthesia at the time, they successfully removed the large majority of the trunk-like growth. After the surgery, Joseph was able to eat and talk more easily and considered ways through which he could escape the dreaded workhouse. He wrote a letter to Mr. Sam Torr, a comedian and proprietor of the Gaiety Palace of Varieties in Leicester, who was on the hunt for performers for a freak show that was scheduled to tour Britain. The two men came to an understanding whereby Merrick would become the star of the show, billed as the Elephant Man, half a man and half an elephant. Joseph's first public display took place at a music hall in Nottingham called The Living. Then he was showcased in his hometown of Leicester. However, he got his big break in London, where he ended up in the company of Tom Norman, a British version of the infamous American showman and freak show organizer P.T. Barnum. In return for exhibiting himself, Merrick was paid half of the profits of the show, which was very lucrative. Biographers estimate that, over the course of 30 months working for Tom Norman, Merrick earned around £50, a lot of money in the 1880s. This was not uncommon, and many freak show performers of the era became very wealthy. Advertisements for the Elephant Man in London implored prospective audience members to brace yourselves to witness one who is probably the most remarkable human being ever to draw the breath of life. At the show, when Norman pulled back the curtain for the first time, an audible gasp rang through the air. Norman then urged the crowd not to despise or condemn this man on account of his unusual appearance. Throughout, Norman made sure to approach and talk about his subject with some compassion, which reflected his own belief that his shows provided his exhibits with financial security and a place in society which they could not acquire elsewhere. This was true. Appearing in the shows, for instance, allowed Merrick to escape the workhouse in Leicester. As word of the Elephant Man proliferated, Merrick caught the attention of medical personnel curious about his condition, including Frederick Treves, who worked just across the road at the London Hospital and was part of the Pathological Society of London, which studied unique medical phenomenon. Joseph, though, was reluctant to be treated and only agreed to see the doctors 2 to 3 times. He later commented on how he found the experience dehumanizing. "I was stripped naked and felt like an animal in a cattle market." Unfortunately, the exhibition which provided Merrick's livelihood came to an abrupt end when the Whitechapel Road venue, where it was being held, was suddenly closed down by police. Norman blamed Treves for this development, believing that he had informed the authorities after Merrick had denied his request to see him for a medical examination. Perhaps this was true. There was a gathering backlash against the freak shows within cities like London as doctors began arguing that people with often life-threatening medical conditions were being stigmatized by society through no fault of their own. After the raid, Norman had no other option but to embark on a national tour with his star exhibit. This had been their intention all along, but now it commenced earlier than planned. Travelling with Sam Roper's fare, Joseph was generously provided with his own private caravan and soon made friends with the other acts, including 2 boxers with dwarfism named Bertram Dooley and Harry Bramley, who often used their fighting know-how to come to the rescue of their disfigured friend. On one occasion, in Northampton, when Merrick was being accosted by a group of local ruffians who were trying to snatch his cloak away, Harry suddenly appeared and knocked the ringleader out with a single punch. Wherever he went, it seemed Joseph's presence always attracted attention of the unwanted variety. The problem was that the Elephant Man's appearance was so shocking that some people complained about him to their local authorities. By 1885, the writing seemed to be on the wall for the freak shows, at least in London, where, by the end of the 1880s, changes in local government would ensure that there was increased regulation of the venues where these could be staged, while there was increasing condemnation of them. Sensing the shifting sands and with the novelty value of the Elephant Man wearing thin after many appearances around the capital and Britain, Sam Roper asked one of his managers, a man of uncertain identity only known as Ferrari, to take Joseph to Belgium to embark on a European tour. But the enterprise proved a disaster from the very start, its progress impeded by all the same obstacles that had made it commercially unviable in the United Kingdom. Almost every time they set up, they were forced to pack up by local law enforcement who were seemingly shutting down shows with as much zeal as the British police force. After a few months of this, it eventually dawned on the manager, Ferrari, that this was a venture doomed to fail, and so one day in June 1886, while in Brussels in Belgium, he took the decision to abandon the Elephant Man and steal all of his money. The penniless Joseph, whose advanced condition made it nearly impossible to communicate with anyone, was now cast adrift in a foreign country where he did not speak the language. He dealt with this situation by selling the few possessions he still had to purchase a ticket which allowed him to board the cross-channel ferry between Ostend and Dover. But after an uncomfortable train ride from Brussels to Ostend, during which he was swarmed and stared at by wide-mouthed strangers, his appearance was deemed so offensive by the captain of the ferry once he arrived that he was refused passage. Joseph was now at his most desperate, but he was saved by a convenient stroke of good fortune when an individual called Wardell Cardew spotted him among the crowds and took him in. Provided with food, shelter, and medical attention, Cardew urged Joseph to go to the Belgian harbour of Antwerp, where he could catch a ship to Harwich, just outside of London. Thankfully, he was allowed on board by the captain of the SS Norwich, which set off at 5 p.m. on the evening of the 23rd of June 1886 to deliver him safely across the English Channel by 4 a.m. the next morning, after which a train to London whisked him over the last 65 miles. At 6:50 a.m. the train arrived at Liverpool Street Station, but Joseph had not planned what to do when he reached this point. Thus, he found somewhere to settle down and consider his next move. As usual, a small crowd, awestruck by the strangeness of his physical attributes, formed around him. It eventually became so large that Merrick was taken away by security to the third-class waiting room where he collapsed. Knowing the police would be unable to make sense of his speech, he then reached into his pocket and gave them a card that had the details of Dr. Frederick Treves of the London Hospital written on it, despite the less than ideal circumstances surrounding his previous interactions with Treves. A message was sent, and the doctor soon arrived at the station where, shouldering through the gathering throng, he found Merrick huddled close to the wall of the waiting room as if it would somehow swallow him up. Taking charge of him, Treves bundled Merrick into a horse-drawn taxicab that snaked through the streets to the London hospital. When they arrived at the hospital, Joseph fell into a deep sleep, exhausted from the entire ordeal in Belgium and his journey home. His slumber was only disrupted once more when a nurse, who was oblivious to his condition, walked in with a tray of food, only to throw it to the ground in shock and run out of the room he had been provided with. As his patient rested and recovered, Dr. Treves took the opportunity to examine him, which he had only done once before when Merrick had been in London with Tom Norman. His conclusion then had been that the Elephant Man's underlying health was relatively good, despite his surface physical abnormalities. This second time round, though, he was shocked at the level of deterioration that had taken place across a span of just a year and a half, for within this short period, in addition to further growths and tissue damage, Joseph had developed bronchitis and the beginnings of a heart condition. The tissue damage and growths had also led to some tissue necrosis, while the simple fact was that the overlap of skin made it difficult for him to bathe, and a severe odour was coming from ulcers that had developed on Joseph's body. After a couple of days, Merrick began recovering some of his strength, while the smell that emanated from him was dissipated by regular baths once or twice a day. All of those who tended to him were volunteers who were briefed on his appearance before they entered the room in order to prevent a repeat of the first nurse's reaction. At first, the traumatized Joseph would shake in panic when anyone he didn't know got close to him, and every time someone knocked on the door, he would be overcome by a shudder of anxiety which would course through every fibre of his crooked being. But after a short adjustment period, he got used to the new faces, his disposition changing from terrified to cautious, and then gradually to relaxed once he had come to know the doctors and nurses tending to him. Eventually, the Elephant Man struck up friendships with some of the hospital staff who often brought and helped him assemble cardboard cutout models from a local toy store to while away the hours. Each and every time one was finished, Merrick made a point of gifting it to the hospital workers as a token of appreciation for their care of him since, because his speech wasn't understandable, he couldn't convey this orally. The only person that could decipher his words was Dr. Treves, who had worked out a way of understanding Joseph during his daily visits. Unfortunately, though, following 5 months of near around-the-clock medical attention, uncomfortable questions regarding the Elephant Man's status as a patient surfaced. His presence had put the hospital in an awkward legal bind. The problem was that technically Merrick, who was accommodated in an area of the hospital usually reserved for private patients or those who had contracted infectious diseases, wasn't entitled to ongoing treatment at the London hospital because it didn't normally accept chronic cases like his, nor was he providing payment for the care which he was receiving. With no other institution willing to take him on, it became a real possibility that Joseph would simply be abandoned and left to fend for himself on the harsh streets of London. Therefore, Dr. Treves and the hospital authorities did something that had never been done before. With the help of Francis Carr Gomm, the chairman of the London hospital, a fundraising appeal was launched to finance Joseph's care. A letter by Carr Gomm was printed in the Times newspaper on Saturday the 4th of December 1886. The article aroused the sympathies of the reader by detailing Merrick's various misfortunes, like his cheerless childhood, his stint in the workhouse, and how he had been forced to sell his last few possessions to escape Europe after his manager's betrayal. As word of his story spread, other newspapers and publications took it upon themselves to launch additional fundraisers, increasing the total money donated to £230 within a few weeks, which was more than enough to pay for his expenses at the London hospital for a long time to come. Now officially a permanent resident there, the London hospital management selected 2 basement bedrooms which, located down a concrete staircase just off an internal courtyard called Bedstead Square, were to become Merrick's new quarters after renovations. The larger of the spaces which was illuminated by natural light from glass panels on the door, was transformed into a room fitted with a specially made bed, a custom-built armchair, and a cosy fireplace, while the second, smaller room was converted into a bathroom with no mirrors. In this quiet annex of the hospital, which became known as Elephant House, Joseph was visited regularly by the nurses and Dr. Treves. Other familiar staff were the house surgeons at the hospital who, instructed by Treves to make routine calls, became some of the few people to really get to know the Elephant Man on a personal level. One of these surgeons was called Wilfred Grenfell, who, writing later in his autobiography, discovered to his surprise that Joseph maintained an upbeat disposition despite his circumstances. He noted that Merrick was always incredibly proud of his left arm, one of his few body parts which was untouched by his condition. Grenfell also noted that Merrick had quite a dry, black sense of humour. But in this latter stage of his life, the individual who got to know him the best was Frederick Treves. The chief surgeon not only saw him every day, but would also set aside a couple of hours to casually talk to him on a Sunday morning, giving Merrick an opportunity to have intellectually stimulating conversations on a variety of topics. In doing so, Treves began to realize that the folds and flaps of his outward appearance, which shocked people when they first saw him, masked the fact that underneath he was actually quite an intelligent man, forcing him to discount a previous assumption that the Elephant Man was not very bright. In becoming one of the first people to dig beneath the surface of who Joseph Merrick was, Treves became transfixed by the internal workings of his patient's mind, a mind that had been so deprived of such basic human experiences that everything seemed to fascinate him. As he delved deeper, the doctor began to understand that a large majority of Joseph's knowledge of the world was derived not through lived experience, but from accounts and descriptions he had read in books, one of the Elephant Man's few consistent companions in a life of near constant isolation. The most curious revelation was that Merrick often spoke about fictional stories as if they were fact, and about fictional characters as if they were real people, like he was living a completely separate life in his head. And because he had obtained so many of his impressions from what he had read over the years, his image of the ideal man or woman also came not from his face-to-face interactions with them, of which there were few positive examples, but from how they were represented in these artistic works. Joseph's conception of a noble man, for instance, was a combination of the heroic qualities espoused in 19th century literature, combined with the luxury and idleness of the aristocracy commonly depicted on the advertisements of newspapers which he liked to flick through. His notion of a perfect female was also distorted through a literary lens, giving him grounds to believe that all women were precious and unapproachable objects of romantic worship. His mother's death had also clearly left a lasting mark on him as a child, a negative emotion that persisted up until his final years, as Joseph Merrick often experienced long and powerful bouts of depression brought on by the merciless advance of his disease, which, before long, had enlarged his limbs to such a degree that it was impossible for him to carry out even small, simple tasks. Making his sorrow worse was sleeplessness, caused by the fact that the fleshy, bony bulges of his face were so heavy they would crush his skull every time he lay flat to rest, forcing him to adopt an uncomfortable, upright, fetal position with his head in his knees every time he closed his eyes. Treves soon realized that something had to be done to stop his patient from spiraling into hopelessness, so he concocted a plan to provide Joseph with some female companionship to lift his spirits. For this task, his thoughts turned to Mrs. Layla Maturin, a young upper-class widow and acquaintance who had lost her husband after just 2 months of marriage. For the idea to work, and for Merrick to get comfortable with her presence, Treves believed it was of the utmost importance that his lady friend did not recoil in horror when she first laid eyes on him, and so she was informed of his condition beforehand. When the door swung open, Layla gave him a warm smile and took his hand while Treves introduced her, only for the elephant man to burst into tears and to rock his enormous head into his knees to and fro, for it was the first time an unknown, attractive young lady had approached him without turning away in fear. This was the confidence boost that Merrick had so desperately needed, for over the last few years of his life he would find himself meeting many strange new faces as his celebrity status grew as a result of the Times article and the fundraiser. The earliest indication of this was when renowned actor couple the Kendalls became aware of his existence after a visit from the husband, William Hunter Kendall, who noted, "The extraordinary thing is that out of that distorted frame came the most musical voice." After relaying his experience to his wife, veteran actress Madge Kendall began sending Joseph gifts, including one of the earliest versions of the gramophone invented only a decade previously, which allowed Merrick to live the rest of his days with musical accompaniment. To show his appreciation for such an amazing present, he sent her a cardboard model of an intricately decorated Gothic church, and although the likelihood is that she never had a personal encounter with him, the two did keep in touch with regular letters. It was because of this contact that he learned how to make baskets after he mentioned in a letter that he had always wanted to learn the craft, with Joseph sweetly giving her his first finished piece to thank her. Madge Kendall was just one of several admirers and correspondents who in later years lavished Merrick with presents, money, and the pleasures of face-to-face conversation, his difficult speech often translated with the help of hospital staff. Joseph was a man who had always been ignored by the opposite sex, so he was particularly enthralled when duchesses and countesses went to see him or sent him signed photographs, which he displayed in his room with pride. Even members of the royal family came, such as the Prince and Princess of Wales, the future King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra, who graced him with their presence on the 21st of May 1887, while ceremonially opening a new area of the hospital called the Alexandra Wing. Huddling into his room with a large entourage, the Prince and Princess shook his hand, conversing with him about all the gifts he had displayed, and even giving him a new one to talk about when they presented him with a silver watch. Afterwards, the Elephant Man was grateful when the Princess of Wales sent him a signed photograph of herself, which he framed and hung on the wall. Princess Alexandra visited him on several more occasions and sent him 3 Christmas cards with personal messages every year, while the Prince of Wales sometimes sent him game meat acquired from royal hunts. As the spotlight over him brightened, Joseph became more and more self-assured, which in turn inspired him to test the limits of his physical capabilities. Whereas before he had preferred to hide himself out of sight in his basement lair, he now had the confidence to attempt late evening walks around the hospital and the courage to open the curtains of his apartment to talk to people passing by, often wearing a specially designed cap and mask so that he could avoid excessive public scrutiny when he walked the streets of the city. Dr. Treves, who loved introducing Joseph to new experiences because of the childlike wonder it evoked in him, accompanied his patient to his first outing to the West End, where, thanks to Madge Kendall's contacts, he observed the performance from the comfort of a private box owned by a baroness at the Theatre Royal on Drury Lane, where he was placed at the back, shrouded in shadow, so the audience could not see him. The production left Joseph wonderstruck for weeks after, with Treves later writing how his reaction was not so much that of delight as of wonder and amazement. He was awed. He was enthralled. The spectacle left him speechless, so that, if he were spoken to, he took no heed. Merrick's personal and social life had reached its apex, yet none of this could put a stop to the ruthless deterioration of his health that was always happening in the background. Bony lumps and thick flaps of skin had continued to grow without pause, and the trunk on his upper lip, that had been amputated a couple of years previously, had returned with a vengeance to horribly misshape his mouth once again. He was frequently struck down by bouts of bronchitis, affected by a weakening heart, and over the course of 5 years his peculiar condition had caused him to prematurely age, so that by 1888 he seemed like an old man, despite only being about to enter his late 20s. In 1889, Merrick spent some of his final months in rural bliss when a charitable noblewoman called Lady Louisa Knightley offered him the chance to stay at a picturesque cottage located on her private estate in Northamptonshire, Fawsley Park. Over the course of 3 vacations, Joseph was able to explore the beauty of the British countryside for the first time, excitedly writing letters to Dr. Treves in the middle of the forest, bursting with descriptions of the flowers, animals and streams he had never had the chance to see close up before. After this life-affirming experience, he returned to the London hospital, falling with familiar ease back into a daily schedule which involved waking up at midday, reading throughout the afternoon, and going out unseen in the evening to stretch his legs in the hospital garden. On Friday, the 11th of April 1890, a nurse came into his chambers to find Merrick sitting up in bed and sleeping as normal. Then, at 1:30 p.m., when he usually got up, another nurse left him a tray of lunch to eat at his own leisure. Finally, about an hour and a half later, one of the house surgeons went to call on him, only to find him dead, lying flat across his bed with the lunch untouched. In the inquest that followed, it was officially concluded that Merrick had accidentally suffocated after the weight of his head had pulled his body down into a flat position while he was sleeping, which had caused the hefty carbuncles on his face to block his windpipe. But the explanation didn't sit right with the man who knew him best, Frederick Treves, who believed the fact that he was found dead on his back suggested a different story. In the past, Joseph had often told him of his desire to lie down and rest on his back like a normal person, and the surgeon believed he had died of a broken neck after attempting to do just this. In a touching dedication immortalized in his 1923 work, The Elephant Man and Other Reminiscences, Treves paid tribute to his longtime patient and friend by writing that, despite his physical abnormalities, the spirit of Merrick, if it could be seen in the form of the living, would assume the figure of an upstanding and heroic man, smooth-browed and clean of limb, and with eyes that flashed undaunted courage. For the first 5 years of his life, Joseph Carey Merrick was like any other normal, healthy infant in Leicester, until the swelling up of his lower lip and right cheek indicated something was terribly wrong. As his condition, which was quite possibly caused by Proteus syndrome, though we cannot be 100% sure, developed to give him stranger and stranger proportions, Joseph became more and more of an outcast at school and increasingly reliant on his mother to provide company and comfort. This was cruelly taken away from him following her death when he was still a child, after which he was forced to live with an abusive stepmother who despised him and an emotionally unavailable father. Merrick tried his best to maintain a steady job as a door-to-door salesman, but his appearance made customers shrink away in horror. After a brutal beating from his father and stint in the workhouse, he made the decision to exhibit himself as part of a travelling freak show. For 30 months, he was taken under the wing of Tom Norman, who treated and paid him well, while his unique case drew the attention of Dr. Frederick Treves, who examined him on several occasions. All was going well until freak shows across Britain began to be shut down because of moral objections from the general public. When Joseph went to Europe, he encountered all the same obstacles. Then his new manager stole his money and abandoned him in Brussels. Through a combination of determination and luck, he somehow made it back to Liverpool Street Station in London, where, exhausted, hungry, and paralysed with indecision, he fell back on the aid of Dr. Treves. The Elephant Man lived the rest of his days as a permanent resident in the London hospital, overseen by the protective gaze of the staff there. A successful newspaper appeal to pay for his care raised his profile so considerably that he attracted the interest and philanthropy of celebrities, aristocrats, and even members of the royal family. His rich and famous patrons showered him with gifts and attention, while also using their wealth and connections to allow him to enjoy life-affirming experiences he had never had before. His death in April 1890 came at just 27 years of age, but during his final years he did much to contribute to the growing awareness in Victorian society that people should not react unkindly to those with physical abnormalities and serious health conditions. What do you think of Joseph Merrick? Was he a victim of a harsh society that ostracized him, or is his life story actually more indicative of a growing tolerance of people who suffered from rare medical conditions? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.